Hey guys. So we didn't get taken on the Enochian flood date, but all those amazing flood connections to that date that we found did confirm for us that it was indeed the correct flood date. So I believe that means that there's now a 7-day tarry. So from this date right here, which like I said was the flood date, we now have a 7-day tarry. So from Enochian pre-Exodus 217 to 224. And I believe a 7-day tarry after the 217 flood date was hinted at in the years of the first and second great American eclipses, because the year of 2017 really seems to signal the flood date of 217. I can't think of any other biblical meaning for those numbers. And then given that the second great American eclipse occurred in 2024, that signals 224. So altogether it signals this 7-day tarry period after the flood date. And a confirmation comes from the book of Genesis in the flood chapter itself, Genesis chapter 7, because it ends on verse 24. So you have Genesis 7:24. And if you look at that numerically, since Genesis is the first book, Genesis 7:24 is 1:7:24. And then you can add the 1 and the 7 to get 8:24, which is equivalent to pre-Exodus 2:24. Again, hinting at a 7-day tarry after the flood date of 217. And a 7-day tarry after the flood date also lines up perfectly with the Acts voyage mapping. Because if you recall from my last video, both the literal and astronomical versions of the Acts voyage mapping happen to place the crossing of the Strait of Messina on the 217 flood date. And after they cross that strait, there's a 7-day tarry in Puteoli, likewise taking us to 224. So it's very possible that we fly on that date or the day after, considering that in that voyage they actually departed for Rome on the day after that 7th day in Puteoli. So either Enochian 824 or 825 is my target watch period. So that corresponds to December 10th through the 12th. And Enochian 824 is also the quote-unquote 24th day of the month, which would fulfill Haggai 2, verses 20 and 23, because it says in verse 23 that Haggai is taken on that day, referring back to verse 20 where it says the 24th day of some unspecified month. And it's fitting if that ends up being the 24th day of an Enochian month, because the book of Haggai is based on the Enochian calendar. Also, isn't it interesting that Enochian 824 ends on the same day that Rabbinical 911 begins, considering that Haggai 2 is the 911th chapter of the Bible? Now, Enochian 824 on the moon sliver calendar is 8-8, so you've got your 88 there, and Enochian 825 on the moon sliver calendar is 8-9, and that's kind of interesting because it's 8-9 in the 89th month since the Revelation 12 sign, which we learned from our Amos 8 study. And speaking of Amos 8, according to Amos 8:5, the harvest can start when the new moon is gone and when the Sabbath is gone. And already on, looks like December 7th, those conditions are met because the new moon is gone, because that's the day of the first quarter moon, and it's also the day after the Sabbath. So our target watch period definitely meets the harvest conditions set forth in Amos 8:5. Alright, so now let me show you how the 276 sign contains encoded information that also points to my target watch period. So first we'll look at December 11th, which straddles Enochian 824 and 25. And December 11th on the Gregorian calendar is equivalent to 1128 on the Julian calendar. And 1128 obviously telegraphs Acts 28:11, which, if you recall, was the moon verse of the 276 sign, because it was from that verse that we derived the position of the moon in that sign. And December 11th is exactly 349 days after that sign. Now, if we reverse the chapter-verse signature of Acts 28:11, we get 1182, which I'm going to interpret as 11.82. And I suspected that 11.82 refers to the number of synodic lunar orbits. Okay, so if we want to figure out how much time that is, we just have to take 11.82 and multiply it by the number of days in a synodic lunar orbit, which is 29.53 days. And that gives us 349 days. which, as we just saw, is the exact number of days from the 276 sign to December 11th. So amazingly, the Acts 28:11 chapter verse signature might encode the number of orbits of the moon around the Earth from the 276 sign to the Rapture, which would be amazing. All right, so now looking at the day after that, which is December 12th, we see that December 12th is exactly 350 days after the 276 sign. Now, I had a hunch to look at how many sidereal lunar orbits 350 days is equivalent to. And sidereal lunar orbits are slightly different from the synodic lunar orbits that I was referring to up here. A synodic lunar orbit is the number of days it takes to go from one moon phase to the exact same moon phase. So, for instance, if it's currently the full moon, it takes exactly 29.53 days to get to the next full moon. That's a synodic lunar orbit. A sidereal lunar orbit is slightly different. It's like if the moon is currently over, for example, the grain sheaf of Virgo, a sidereal lunar orbit is how long it will take the moon to orbit and return to that exact same position over the grain sheaf of Virgo. So after exactly 27.32 days, the length of a sidereal lunar orbit, the moon would arrive right back at that exact position in the sky. So anyway, like I said, I wanted to see how many sidereal lunar orbits 350 days is equivalent to, which is pretty easy. All you have to do is take 350 and divide it by the length of a sidereal lunar orbit, which is 27.32 days. And you get this number right here, 12.81112737. So that means 350 days is equivalent to 12.81112737 sidereal lunar orbits. And that's actually amazing because if we take a close look at that number and interpret this one and this one as delimiters, as I've done here, it reveals these two numbers, 2811 and 2737. And those two numbers ought to be familiar to us by now because those are the chapter verse signatures of the two verses which define the 276 sign. Acts 27:37 defines the position of the sun in the 276 sign, and Acts 28:11 defines the position of the moon in the 276 sign. So in other words, that number, which encodes the verses which define the 276 sign, may also be the number of sidereal lunar orbits from the 276 sign to the Rapture, which would be amazing. Now, another thing that's pointing to my high watch period is the earthquake that shook Thessaloniki a few weeks back, which I had mentioned in a previous video. And I believe this earthquake is a clear warning from God about the sudden destruction described in 1 Thessalonians 5:3. Now, the first clue is that this earthquake shook the city of Thessaloniki, which is where the Thessalonian church was located, and it was also a magnitude 5.3 earthquake. So that clearly points to 1 Thessalonians 5:3, which speaks of sudden destruction coming upon the world as travail upon a woman with child. And of course, it also telegraphs the 153 number, referring to the catch of 153 large fish. And not only was it a magnitude 5.3 earthquake, it also happened to occur at 5:03 p.m. local time. This just shows UTC time here, but in local time it was 5:03 p.m. So that's another thing pointing to 1 Thessalonians 5:3. And yet another confirmation is that the epicenter of this earthquake is 883 miles from Jesus' birthplace, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And 883 is the 153rd prime number, which also points to 1 Thessalonians 5:3. Now, this earthquake occurred on November 3rd, and from November 3rd to December 11th, it's exactly 5 weeks and 3 days. So from the 5.3 magnitude earthquake that occurred at 5:03 p.m. local time, it's 5 weeks and 3 days to December 11th. And remember, that's the date that straddles both Enochian 824 and 825. And we also see here that December 11th is the 346th day of the year, which is interesting because if you take a look at the digits of pi, you see that the first occurrence of the number 153 in pi ends on the 346th digit of pi. So this is the 344th, this is the 345th, and the 3 here is the 346th digit of pi. potentially pointing to the 346th day of the year, 5 weeks and 3 days after the 1 Thessalonians 5:3 earthquake. Now, Enochian 825 begins on 1211, but it ends on 1212, and the date of 1212 was recently signaled by an event that occurred in New York City, in which this United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson, was fatally shot outside of a Hilton hotel. And the reason this event is signaling 1212 is because he was shot right in front of 1335 Avenue of the Americas. And 1335 is only found in one place in the Bible, and that would be Daniel 12:12. Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1335 days. And he was also shot at 6:44 a.m., which is the 404th minute of the day. And there are 404 verses in the book of Revelation. So altogether, I think that this event is hinting that the book of Revelation will be commencing, if you will, on 12/12 or December 12th. And the verse right after Daniel 12:12 is Daniel 12:13, which mentions the end of the days. And this is also the last verse in the book of Daniel. And that 12:13 there is interesting because my high watch period of December 10th through 12th is about 1213 weeks after 9/11. And the date of 12/12/2024 is interesting numerically because if you reduce that date, it reduces to 338, giving you the number 338, a number which is definitely connected to the rapture because the word taken occurs 338 times in the King James Version Bible, and 338 is also 833 reversed, signaling Psalm 83:3. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people and consulted against thy hidden ones. Thy hidden ones, of course, referring to those who were raptured. And by the way, that is the only verse in the Bible that contains the expression hidden ones. And what's also interesting is that if the rapture were to occur on Thursday the 12th, the next day would be Friday the 13th. And if Friday the 13th of December is the first full day of the tribulation period, then that could very well be why they've always programmed us with that. And another thing that's pointing to December 12th is that on the date of 9/11, George W. Bush was in a classroom reading a children's book to children. And last year on December 12th, Barack Obama participated in an almost identical ritual in a Chicago classroom, which at the time many found ominous. Now, it occurred to me that what's possibly going on here is that they had George W. Bush perform the classroom ritual on the date of 9/11, and then they had Barack Obama perform the classroom ritual on the date of the second 9/11, December 12th, except in this case, it's done exactly 1 year prior, meaning that December 12th in 2024 would be the actual date of the second 9/11. Alright, so one last look at my high watch period. So like I said, my high watch period is Enochian 824 and 825, which on the Gregorian calendar is December 10th through the 12th. And during this watch period, a galactic wedding ring will be forming in the heavens, composed of the Sun and the Milky Way, forming the band. So if you look at the ecliptic from a top-down view, you'll see what looks uncannily like a wedding ring. What a wonderful gift from Jesus to his bride just before he lifts her off to heaven. So on that note, I will end the video. I thank you for watching. Maranatha, and God bless.